friend of mine over the years has often observed that Jesus used small groups to change the world. And I always found that to be a powerful insight, that Jesus invested in relationship, that he invested in knowing people at an intimate level. And the other part that I always appreciate about the stories of how Jesus interacts with people is that he was in conversation with people. He was listening, he was speaking. And I think all the best conversations we have involve both speaking and listening. And one of the challenges sometimes as we move into the online platform is that we know how to interact when we're in a building. We know how to interact when we see people. It became a bit more challenging when we went online. At first, it was enough we were able to do worship. And it was sort of like a broadcast or a TV program, but we know we're about something deeper than that. And now it's about how do we engage people at a deeper level, that they're not just an audience, but we're a community together.
I think that's right, Richard. I think that really the key here is to figure out how to meet people, to both listen to them and to speak to them in a way that builds a reciprocal kind of relationship where there's some mutual benefit, there's a genuine mutuality. And we're not always as good at that online as we are in the divisiveness of social media. Sometimes we're more using it as a platform as opposed to a relationship, and we use it to share an idea, and I see a lot of that. So thinking about all this together. I think the other thing that's important is people need more than Sunday to live a Christian life. And new people, if all you really have is a way for existing people to gather, maybe even in small groups, and you have Sunday worship as your only public space, then there is no on-ramp to congregational life. And the reality is that if you're going to meet people online, then you have to provide on-ramps where people can get involved in congregational life. And small groups, both physically gathered ones and online ones and hybrid ones, which we'll talk about as well, where there may be some people who are zooming in online on a monitor while other people are in the same room physically. These are critical places for new people to build relationship and for existing people to maintain those. So be thinking about them from that perspective.
And the other thing I would add is that as the church, we are always trying to invite people to go deeper. And small groups really become an opportunity to do that. And the beauty of it is that in a small group, we are able to help people stay connected with each other. And it's a place where relationship happens. It's a place where deep change happens. It's a way for us to pay attention to how God is at work with us and in our lives. And I find it to be one of the most powerful places to nurture faith. Worship is, by the way, I love worship, but I've found that often some of the most important transformation I've seen in people's lives has taken place in small groups. It's also a place where people have been able to support each other, encourage each other. And I hope that every small group has a vision in itself of how we take this relationship out. How do we take this out into the world, that we serve our neighbor, that we serve the gospel, that it's always about something more than us, because it is. It's about us, but more than us.
I think that's right. That if we don't think of it as more than ourselves, but about ourselves, we can easily get into kind of spiritualized secular humanists if we're not careful, as opposed to viewing ourselves as connecting with God and then extending the ministry of Jesus through the incarnation in our own lives. And groups are a way to kind of help people reflect on that and then do that, because they've got these accountable, meaningful partnerships.
Yeah, and part of this too is to recognize that we have small groups already. They're taking place in all sorts of ways. But one of the things I would want us to notice is just some of the forms of small groups we have and the things that happen there, whether it's spiritual formation, whether it's equipping people for servanthood as an opportunity. When you speak of the on-ramp, it's one of the ways we're going to do evangelism. But one of the other things I've noticed too is that one of the gifts that has been emerging in this season has been the increasing number of affinity groups I've seen in our synod and throughout the church. And this becomes an opportunity for people to gather, and to gather in ways that maybe they're learning about something, being equipped for something. But more than that, it's about always, all of these things take place in the gospel. So within our own synod, I'm just, these are some of the things that I've seen, that we have groups that are focused on caring for creation and racial justice, LGBTQIA plus, and how are we equipping allies? How are we making space for young adults and for grief and for divorce? And to be honest with you, we could put another half dozen categories here, but part of it is, what is it that we can identify with? And it's about relationship, it's about gospel, and it's about becoming more and more the people we're called to be.
And I'll be this kind of beating a drum for on-ramps. We have, my wife runs a small group for spiritual practices on Thursday mornings in our congregation. My wife's a rostered deacon. So tomorrow morning she'll have a group online. Tomorrow night we have a racial justice affinity group that meets, and that group will be doing some things related to racism and covenanting and being an anti-racist organization and inclusive and cultural competence, all those things. And there's a woman who got re-energized in our congregation by being involved in the affinity group for spiritual practices that meets in the morning. But she's a trainer and a social worker in our school district for racism and anti-racism and cultural competency. And she got connected with this, re-energized through one group, heard about the other, said, I want to be on that. So tomorrow night she'll be at the racial justice. She's a woman that's a very talented person, but has been less engaged in congregational life really for a couple of years when we were physical. Now we're online, and there's affinity group she's connected with, and she's in 2 of them and going to be a real resource. So these are real opportunities to take people who've been off-ramped or maybe not connected at all and bring them back on. Don't ever think that this isn't like the real deal. Because this is a woman who's not been as involved and connected, but sees some real opportunities. And wow, these affinity groups and the fact that we can do things online, she's jazzed.
And Dave, I would notice a couple things about that, is that her life is being changed and you're engaging her gifts more deeply. So one of the gifts of these affinity groups too has been that we are recognizing this wide range of gifts in the body of Christ that we had often not always been able to appreciate as fully as we could. And it's a really powerful way of living into our call to
Absolutely.
be just people.
No, she's being cared for and she's feeling useful.
Yeah. And so another thing I do want to lift up in terms of our affinity groups, and this has been a key piece in many of our churches, has been also that in our small groups, they provide this opportunity for care, because it's relationship. And so sometimes where I see one individual, the pastor or the deacon, trying to do the care for an entire community, that was never how it was intended to be. So as we live into small groups, we have a network and a community in which we care for each other. And so I see this as pieces that are interconnected, and it really makes our ability to care for one another that much more effective, that much more faithful.
Richard, one of the things I've seen in the pandemic, and it's kind of a sad commentary on the state of the church before in many ways, but many congregations have started talking to people who don't come to worship because of the pandemic. They said, oh man, our people aren't going to feel connected. We should start calling people and talking to people. So they went through the directory and started calling people, including people who weren't coming to worship that they weren't calling before in the first place. And one of the things the pandemic has done is made us very clear about the importance of relationships. And we've put some relationships on that we had been very lazy at. Members who hadn't been in worship for months or years were suddenly getting a phone call from a member saying, well, during the pandemic, and they were often appreciative because the pandemic gave them an excuse to call without having to say, I know we should have called 2 years ago, but we really haven't given a rip about you until the situation made it happen. But the pandemic gave us a new kind of a clean slate, an opportunity to do some things over. And a lot of people who were not very active felt cared for again and have been reconnected. I hear story after story of people because congregations have been much more intentional. So this online opportunity has really improved congregational care in many places, expanding who's doing all kinds of things. Richard, you want to share about your experience in bringing in somebody from a group, and you had someone from Houston get connected. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, and one of the things, since we are talking about becoming a hybrid church, I really think we would be remiss not to mention that we can do things in ways we've never done them before. And right now I have a small group that originally was exclusively in the building. We were an on the ground small group. When we entered the crisis, we became exclusively online. And now we're at a phase in this time in which we are both on the ground and online and at the same time. It's one group, and we have people who gather physically on site, and this does depend on having a good camera, a good microphone, and someone who's willing to be host. But meanwhile, most of the people are still online. And the beauty of being online, and you're going to talk about boosting in the next segment, but one of the beauties of being online is that you can send out invitations and they can travel. And so, yes, we've connected. We have someone who regularly comes to our group now who lives in Houston, Texas. We have people who live in other counties who regularly participate. And the amazing thing is that this group of folks that currently gathers has never all been in the same physical space at one time. And yet we now feel a sense of deep community together. And it really does make a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely.
That we're able to be grouped together. And, I think one other thing that we really want to recognize is that small groups can be done anywhere. And sometimes I've had folks from small congregations say, well, our congregation's a small group. And that may be true. But I'd like to say that congregations any size can do this. And Dave, I think you also.
I want to really dig in. In fact, I'm going to chastise all of us, probably, or many of us. Most of us have spent so much time and energy trying to get worship on that we've forgotten that the reality is that worship requires a quality engagement in terms of equipment and thinking things through and access to technology and time and energy that's really hard to do. And to be honest, all of us need to continue to really work, and worship is a big area of growth. But we really have no excuse for not doing small groups well. Worship is a big learning curve, but you should already know how to do a small group, right? I mean, I know how to do a small group. You get 6 or 8 people together, you pick something to talk about. If you're a good facilitator, you do those kinds of things to get everybody talking. You have some snacks maybe so people can eat together. You pray at the end, and you try to have some sense of purpose and mission. But online small groups are so accessible. And we have people who come to small groups who would never have come to groups before because it took too long to drive to be at the group. So honestly, I want to say that most of us spent too much time and energy on worship and neglected small groups in many cases. We should be forming new small groups. You can do small groups as well at your congregation because 6 or 8 people can get together on Zoom at your church just as well as they can at some mega church. And the quality will be 100% as good, and probably the theology and practice may be better than a lot of those mega churches, right? Because we think our content and understanding the gospel is great stuff. So reality is, all of us can do small groups better than many of those mega churches. We probably can't compete with them for technology and worship and all those things, but we can do this. Every one of us can do this. We can make space. We can create relationships. It's not about size when it's a small group. It's about intentionality. And that's what I really want to urge us all to do, to be much more intentional in this area. Richard, you were going to say something also.
Yeah, and intentionality, and also to recognize our ability to partner with each other right now. That if you're trying to do an affinity group and you say, well, we don't have anyone who does, really understands this. You might have a neighbor church that does, and now distance doesn't matter because your neighbor church could be 50 miles away.
My wife has people on her spiritual practices from 4 different congregations, and including 2 people who come pretty rarely who are from no congregations. So absolutely, the possibilities are really endless in this, and we just want to cultivate your imagination, and as we do, to get you thinking about this again.
And have fun.
Have a good time with this and play with it, because small groups are really meaningful. So as we finish this, I just want to encourage you the same thing. What did you hear as we thought about this segment that caught your attention or made you say, aha? What did we say that was challenging? Maybe it even kind of went, what? I don't think I don't think so, or whatever. And then think about what are the ideas that come to mind for what you could be doing in your setting to enhance the quality and the quantity really of small groups. We're going to pause this for a little bit and give you some time, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and have our last section together. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for the sharing that you're going to do as you share what you reflect.